My daughter placed a medication order on my kitchen table and asked why her electronic signature appeared at the bottom. The patient had been dead for 11 minutes when the order entered the hospital system. Her surgeon husband called it a clerical error. I had investigated medical fraud for 28 years. Clerical errors do not authenticate themselves. I appreciate you settling in with me for this one. Before we begin, leave me a quick comment. Have you ever discovered someone close to you was hiding who they really were? Yes or no? I read every one of those answers. A small note: some details in this story have been shaped for narrative and reflection. The message behind it is what truly matters. I never told my son-in-law that I spent 28 years hunting the most dangerous medical criminals in America as a senior special agent for the United States Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Inspector General, to Greg Sherwood. I was just Crystal's father, a 69-year-old retiree with a bad hip and reading glasses held together by electrical tape. A man who drove a dented Silverado, wore flannel shirts from the 90s, and shuffled through the farmhouse like someone counting down the years until he stopped counting altogether. Greg never asked what I did before I retired. People rarely do when you look the way I look. They see the stoop, the calloused hands, the slow way I lower myself into a chair, and they write the rest of the story themselves. Government paper pusher, pencil man, nobody. They never picture the man who tracked a fugitive physician through rural Appalachia for 19 days. They never picture the sealed courtrooms, the wiretap affidavits, the midnight raids on billing mills operating out of strip mall clinics in 6 states. They never picture someone like me, because that is exactly the point. I spent my entire career being the man nobody pictured. Greg Sherwood, 41 years old, board-certified surgeon, co-owner of the Cedarbrook Surgical Center in Burlington, Vermont. Married my daughter and never once suspected that the slow old man at the holiday table could take apart everything he had built. He threatened to destroy Crystal's nursing license. He threatened to take custody of my 8-year-old grandson, Tyler. He threatened to bury our family in legal debt so deep we would lose the farmhouse that has been in my wife Ruth's family for 4 generations. He promised consequences. Crystal believed him. But let me take you back to where it started. A quiet Tuesday evening, a kitchen table, and a piece of paper that should not have existed. The wood stove had been burning since 4 o'clock, and the kitchen smelled like pine resin and the black coffee Ruth always left on the counter before she went upstairs to read. I was sitting at the table cleaning my reading glasses with the hem of my shirt when I heard the back door open. Crystal's car engine was still ticking as it cooled in the driveway. She came in wearing blue surgical scrubs from Cedarbrook, her coat unzipped despite the January cold. And she was carrying a manila folder the way you carry something that might be alive and dangerous. My daughter is 38 years old. She has her mother's jaw and her grandmother's stubbornness, and she does not scare easily. But her hands were shaking when she placed that folder on the table between us. "Dad, I need you to look at this," she said. "Tell me I am reading it wrong." I opened the folder. Inside was a single printout, a controlled substance order from Cedarbrook's electronic medical records system. The patient's name was at the top. My daughter's electronic signature was at the bottom, and between those 2 lines was a timestamp that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. 11 minutes. A human being had been dead for 11 minutes before my daughter's credentials were used to authorize the medication order that was supposed to save him. This patient was already dead before my signature appeared on that order, Crystal said. Her voice was steady, but her fingers were pressed flat against the table, like she needed the wood to hold her up. How is that possible? I studied the printout the way I have studied 10,000 documents in my career. I noted the timestamp discrepancy. I noted the controlled substance classification. I noted the digital authentication trail that linked the signature to Crystal's login credentials at a terminal she had not been sitting at. I noticed all of this in the time it took Ruth's coffee to stop steaming on the counter. Greg would have called it an administrative error, a system glitch, a meaningless anomaly in a complex medical records platform. I had investigated medical fraud for 28 years. Administrative errors do not authenticate themselves 11 minutes after a patient's heart stops beating. I folded the printout carefully along its original crease. I slid it into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt, right above my heart, and I looked at my daughter. "Sit down, sweetheart. Drink your mother's coffee. We will talk about this in the morning." Crystal thought I was being a calm, reassuring father. She had no idea that the document resting against my chest had just activated a part of me I had not used in 4 years. And the man who had forged her signature had no idea what he had just set in motion. Crystal did not stop at one death. She told me about 3. She sat at my kitchen table with Ruth's cold coffee untouched between her hands and laid the pattern out the way I had taught her to organize problems when she was in high school. Chronological. Factual. No emotion until the facts were finished. The first was Margaret Colby, 71 years old, a retired school teacher from Shelburne who came into Cedarbrook for a routine knee replacement. She died on the operating table. The official report classified it as an idiosyncratic anesthesia reaction. Rare, but documented. No investigation requested. The second was Harold Fenn, 64, a dairy farmer from Williston. Shoulder surgery, same operating room, same classification in the report. Same language, Crystal said, word for word, as if someone had copied the first report and changed the name. The third was the patient whose printout was in my breast pocket. Same cause, same phrasing, same convenient rarity. 3 in 18 months, Crystal said. All classified the same way, all at Cedarbrook. All in Greg's operating room. She waited for me to react. I did not. I sat across from my daughter in the warm yellow light of my kitchen and kept my face the way I had kept it in 1,000 interviews across 28 years of federal service. Neutral, receptive, unreadable. 3 identical causes of death across 18 months in a clinic that size is not a coincidence. In my career, I had a name for that kind of pattern. I called it a signature. Crystal told me she had gone to Greg the next morning. She walked into his private office at Cedarbrook, where Greg Sherwood, 41 years old, stood behind his desk in a monogrammed lab coat that cost more than most of his nurses earned in a week. His jaw was set in the expression of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. Crystal placed the printout on his desk and asked him to explain the timestamp. His composure lasted about 4 seconds. "You signed every order, Crystal," he said, his voice dropping to the register men use when they want to sound reasonable and dangerous at the same time. "Every single one. Your credentials are on every file. If anyone investigates you, are the one they find." Crystal told me she stood there in the fluorescent light of that office, shadows cutting hard lines across the floor, and felt the ground shift underneath her. Greg was not defending himself, he was positioning her. "Walk out that door," he said, "and I will have Tyler by Friday. You will not see him again until he is old enough to hate you for abandoning him." My daughter is not a woman who breaks easily. She survived a residency program that burned out half her class. She delivered her son during a blizzard in a hospital running on backup generators. But I know what Greg's voice does to her. I have heard the way she flinches at sharp tones since the first year of that marriage. So when she told me what she whispered back to him, I believed her, because it was the bravest thing a terrified mother could say. "You would do that to your own son?" Greg did not answer. He sat down, opened his laptop, and began typing as if she had already left the room. Crystal collected Tyler from the clinic's daycare annex without explaining why. Tyler Sherwood, 8 years old, with his mother's wide brown eyes, climbed out of the back seat clutching a stuffed rabbit he had owned since he was 3. He did not know why his mother was crying. He just knew he wanted his grandfather. I heard the gravel crunch in the driveway and reached the front door before Crystal made it to the porch steps. Ruth Harrington, 67, a retired federal prosecutor whose silver hair framed the same sharp eyes that had once stared down racketeers in courtrooms. Met them at the door without a single question. She wrapped Crystal in the rough warmth of her wool cardigan and pulled Tyler against her hip and guided them both inside the way a woman does when she has spent 43 years reading the difference between a bad day and a catastrophe. I stayed in the doorway. The road south toward Burlington was already disappearing into the January darkness. The air smelled like wood smoke and frozen pine. Somewhere 90 minutes down that road, Greg Sherwood was sitting in his clinic, completely certain that the trembling woman who had just walked out of his office was the only threat he would ever need to manage. I rested my hand against the breast pocket of my flannel shirt, where the folded printout pressed warm against my chest. 3 patients were dead. My daughter's name was on every file. And the man responsible was about to learn what happens when you threaten a family whose patriarch has spent 3 decades making dangerous men disappear into federal custody. I closed the front door and locked it. Ruth had taken Crystal and Tyler upstairs. The farmhouse was quiet except for the wood stove ticking as it cooled and the low creak of old floorboards settling into the January cold. I stood in the kitchen with the lights off and waited for whatever Greg would do next. I did not have to wait long. The first text came in at exactly 9:47 that evening. Crystal's phone buzzed on the kitchen table where she had left it. Screen down, as if she could make him disappear by not looking, I turned it over. The blue glow lit up the dark kitchen like a flare. Crystal, let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Come home. We can fix this together. Soft, almost tender. The voice of a man who understood that cruelty works best when it arrives wearing kindness. The second text came 11 minutes later. The tone had already shifted. References to the clinic apartment mortgage, to her professional standing, to conversations he had apparently been having with colleagues about her recent behavior. By 10:18, the mask was off. You have until tomorrow morning. After that, I call Holstead and Carey and we do this the hard way. You know what that means for Tyler. Crystal had come back downstairs for water. She read the message over my shoulder and I felt her body go rigid beside me. Her breath catching the way it does when someone confirms the worst thing you already suspected. He is already talking about lawyers, she whispered. He is going to take Tyler from me. Have you ever watched someone you love receive a message that rewrites the fear on their face in real time? Crystal was not afraid of Greg's anger. She was afraid of his competence. She knew him well enough to understand that the mention of a law firm was not a bluff. It was a receipt. He had already retained them. The custody threat was not a negotiation. It was a countdown. I told Crystal to turn the phone off and go upstairs. She did not argue. She was too tired and too scared to argue, and that combination in my daughter frightened me more than anything Greg had written. I sat alone in the kitchen until midnight. Then I picked up the landline to call an old colleague whose number I still knew by heart. Silence. Not a dial tone. Not static. Silence. The absolute dead nothing of a line that has been physically severed. I set the receiver down and felt something shift in my chest. Not panic. Something colder. Something I had not felt since the night in 2019 when I retired my badge and told myself the work was finished. I pulled on my coat and walked outside to the driveway. The January air hit my face like a slap. My truck sat where I had parked it that afternoon, frost already forming on the windshield. But there was something tucked under the driver's side wiper blade. A business card. Crisp white stock, sharp corners. Not a single fingerprint smudge despite the cold. Holstead and Carey, attorneys at law. Below that, in smaller print, representing Dr. Greg Sherwood. Someone had driven 90 minutes in the dark to place that card on my truck. They had walked onto my property, stood next to my vehicle, and left without making a sound. And before they left, they had cut my phone line. A severed line and a calling card. That is not a legal strategy. That is a predator marking territory. It tells you he was close enough to touch your house while you slept, and confident enough not to care if you found out. A normal father would have called the local police, filed a report, requested a patrol car. But I was not a normal father. I had spent 28 years dealing with men who operated exactly like this. Men who believed their money and their lawyers and their hired hands made them untouchable. Every single one of them had been wrong. And Greg Sherwood was about to join that list. I slipped the business card into my coat pocket next to the folded printout. I did not wake Ruth. I did not wake Crystal. I walked across the frozen yard toward the barn, my boots cracking through the thin crust of ice on the grass. My breath clouded white in the darkness. The barn door groaned when I pulled it open. Behind the heavy workbench, bolted to the concrete floor and hidden beneath a canvas tarp for 4 years, sat a steel safe I had hoped I would never need to open again. I knelt on the cold concrete, tasted metal at the back of my throat, and placed my hand on the dial. The combination came back to my fingers before it came back to my mind. 3 turns right, 2 left, 1 right. Muscle memory from a life I had tried very hard to bury. The lock released with a deep mechanical thunk that echoed off the barn walls, and I swung the heavy door open. The bare bulb overhead cast sharp shadows across the safe's interior. Everything was exactly where I had placed it 4 years ago, resting on the same square of black velvet cloth. My HHS OIG badge. An encrypted Iridium satellite phone in a rubberized case. A tactical vest folded flat. And 4 military-grade surveillance cameras, each no larger than a deck of cards. Originally designed for covert monitoring of healthcare facilities under federal investigation. I lifted the badge and held it under the light. Senior Special Agent, Office of Inspector General, Department of Health and Human Services. The brass and silver caught the bulb's glow the way it always had, and for a moment, I was not a 69-year-old man kneeling on a frozen barn floor. I was the operative who had tracked a fugitive physician through Appalachian backwoods for 19 days. The agent who had testified in sealed courtrooms with blacked-out windows, while his daughter believed he was attending a government accounting seminar in Arlington. I remembered the night I caught a hospital administrator shredding billing records in a parking garage at 2 in the morning. He had looked at me the way they all looked at me. Confused, offended, certain that the disheveled man in the flannel jacket could not possibly be the reason his life was about to end as he knew it. When you spend 28 years hunting men who hide behind credentials and institutional power, you learn one thing above all else. They always believe the white coat protects them, right up until the moment it does not. Crystal grew up believing I pushed paper in a quiet government building. That was the cover story the agency assigned every operative's family. The truth would have meant armed escorts at her school, security briefings before birthday parties, a childhood defined by fear of the men her father was pursuing. I had chosen the lie because the lie kept her safe. I had made peace with it, traded my badge for a rocking chair and a coffee mug, and told myself the work was finished. But Greg Sherwood had just torn up that contract. And the man who had carried this badge through hospital server rooms and grand jury chambers was not as retired as he thought. I powered on the satellite phone. The screen glowed green. Full charge, network acquired. Encryption protocols active. In the contacts list were 2 numbers I had not dialed in 4 years. 2 people who owed me nothing but would give me everything if I asked. I was not ready to call them yet, not until I understood exactly what I was building a case against. But knowing they were 1 dial away changed the weight of everything. I pocketed the phone and picked up the 4 cameras. The work took nearly 3 hours. I moved through the frozen darkness with the efficiency of a man who had done this kind of installation in hospital parking structures, clinic basements, and once inside a pharmaceutical warehouse while security guards slept 40 feet away. The farmhouse property was simpler. I placed the first camera in the hollow of a maple tree overlooking the driveway approach. The second went beneath the eave above the kitchen window, angled to capture the main road in both directions. The third I buried in the stone wall along the north property line, covering the tree line where anyone approaching on foot would have to break cover. The fourth went above the barn door itself, watching the blind spot between the house and the outbuildings. Installing those cameras felt like threading a net, each one a knot pulled tight, each angle a gap sealed shut, until the property was no longer just a farmhouse, but a perimeter, waiting for something to walk inside. I finished as the first gray light touched the ridgeline of the Green Mountains. The cameras were invisible. The feeds linked to a monitor I would set up in the study behind the bookcase, where a panel I had installed during a renovation 12 years ago concealed a space just large enough for a desk and 2 screens. Ruth knew about the panel. Crystal did not. No one else ever would. I stood at the edge of the yard and breathed in the sharp pre-dawn air, tasting cold and pine and something electric underneath. The encrypted phone sat heavy in my coat pocket. The badge was back where it belonged, pressed against my chest. Greg Sherwood was still out there, 90 minutes south, believing he was hunting a frightened old man behind a locked door. He had no idea that every step he took toward this property from now on would be watched, recorded, and cataloged by a man who had spent 3 decades making sure people like him never saw the trap until it closed. Greg's next attack did not come through a text message or a severed phone line. It came through a county deputy who pulled into my driveway at 9 o'clock the next morning, stepped out of a cruiser with his collar turned up against the cold, and handed Crystal a stack of manila folders thick enough to break a spine. She opened the first folder at the kitchen table while I stood behind her. The morning light fell across the pages like it was trying to help her read, and what it illuminated was devastating. A formal state medical board investigation into Crystal's professional conduct. Allegations of negligent record-keeping, falsified patient documentation, and failure to report adverse outcomes. Below that, in a separate folder, a civil liability claim. $2.3 million in damages, filed by Greg Sherwood against Crystal Harrington. Crystal read the first page, and her breathing went shallow. That rapid, airless panting that comes when the body decides it is drowning, even though the lungs are clear. "He is suing me for $2.3 million, she said, her voice cracking on the number. "He says I falsified patient records. Dad, I never touched those records. I swear I never did." She turned another page. Her hands were shaking so badly the paper rattled against the table. "He has the medical board involved now. They can revoke my license. They can recommend criminal charges. I will never work again." When a man like Greg uses the legal system as a weapon, he assumes his target cannot fight back. He assumes lawyers and judges speak a language ordinary people cannot understand. He assumes that a stack of notarized documents will paralyze anyone who receives them, because to most people, a lawsuit is not a document. It is a verdict delivered early, but I had spent 28 years reading that language, and I knew exactly where Greg had just made his first critical mistake. "Let me see the last page, sweetheart," I said. Crystal handed me the folder. I flipped past the allegations, past the billing summaries, past the exhibits I already knew were fabricated, and turned to the final page. The authorizing signature. Dr. Gary Russell, State Medical Board Commissioner, 62 years old, a name Crystal had never heard before. But I had. 12 years ago, during a preliminary fraud review, I ran out of the regional HHS OIG office. I had flagged Russell's name in a pattern of suspicious consulting payments. $8,000 a quarter from 3 different private surgical clinics, all routed through the same medical education LLC. The payments had no corresponding services. The LLC had no employees. The case was shelved for lack of resources before I could build it to indictment. But I never forgot the name, because in my line of work, you do not forget a medical board commissioner who takes money from the clinics he is supposed to regulate. Greg had not just hired a vicious lawyer. He had purchased a medical board commissioner to sign a fraudulent complaint against my daughter. And that commissioner had just made the fatal mistake of putting his name on fabricated documents filed with a state agency. Greg thought that complaint was a death sentence for Crystal. He had no idea he had just handed a retired federal investigator a signed confession of perjury delivered by certified mail to my own kitchen table. I set the folders down. Crystal was staring at me with the expression of a woman watching her life collapse. She did not know that what she saw as destruction, I saw as construction. Greg had built his case on forged evidence and a corrupt signatory. Every page in those folders was a brick I could use. I told Crystal I needed to make a phone call. She nodded without asking who. Ruth came downstairs and sat beside her. And I left them at the table with the cold coffee and the legal papers and the heavy silence of a family under siege. I walked into the study and closed the oak door behind me. The room smelled like old books and the cedar panels I had installed the year Crystal was born. I pulled the encrypted satellite phone from my coat pocket and powered it on. The green screen flickered to life. I scrolled past dozens of dormant contacts, names from sealed operations, numbers from closed cases, men and women I had worked beside in hospital server rooms and federal courthouses, and the back seats of unmarked sedans. I stopped at a name I had not dialed in 20 years. A man who currently ran one of the most ruthless healthcare litigation practices in Vermont. A man who owed me everything he had because of what I did for him on a freezing night in a hospital parking garage in 2003. I pressed call and held the phone to my ear. Dwayne Prescott answered on the second ring, and the 20 years between us evaporated before he finished saying my name. "Leonard Harrington," he said. The corporate polish in his voice cracked on the second syllable. "My God, are you and Ruth safe?" Dwayne Prescott was 57 years old, a healthcare litigation partner in Burlington who billed by the quarter hour and wore hand-stitched suspenders to depositions. He had argued cases before federal appellate panels. He had dismantled hospital compliance departments with subpoenas so precise they read like surgery. But in that moment, on that phone call, he was not a litigator. He was the young federal prosecutor I had pulled out of a very dark place a long time ago. "We are safe for now," I said. "My daughter is not. Her husband is a surgeon running a clinic called Cedarbrook out of Burlington. He has 3 dead patients, a bought medical board commissioner, and a lawsuit aimed at framing Crystal for everything." I gave him the details the way I had given briefings for 28 years, short, sequential, no emotion. Dwayne listened without interrupting, which was a habit I had taught him 2 decades ago in the back of an unmarked sedan. There is a difference between a man who owes you a favor and a man who owes you his life. The first returns your call. The second drops everything and asks where you need him to stand. In 2003, Dwayne was a 37-year-old federal prosecutor who had stumbled onto a Medicare fraud ring operating out of a regional hospital chain in New Hampshire. He was brilliant and relentless and far too young to understand that the men running the ring did not settle disputes through motions and briefs. They settled them in parking garages at midnight. The ring's fixer discovered Dwayne's identity on a Thursday. By Friday night, 2 men were waiting in the stairwell of the hospital parking structure where Dwayne always left his car. I was the HHS OIG agent assigned to protect him. I sat in the dark on the 3rd level for 3 hours, listening to Dwayne's keys rattle inside his locked sedan 20 feet away because his hands would not stop shaking. When the fixer's men came through the stairwell door, I made sure they never reached him. I will not describe what happened next because some things from my career stay in the parking garages where they belong. But Dwayne walked out of that structure alive, and the men who came for him did not walk out at all that night. Afterward, Dwayne told me he would spend the rest of his career repaying the debt. I told him I hoped he would never have to. 20 years later, sitting in my study with the green glow of the encrypted phone illuminating the old leather spines on my bookshelves, I was collecting "Send me every document you have," Dwayne said. His voice had changed. The polish was gone. What replaced it was the hard, flat tone of a man who had decided something. "I will have a team dissecting it before the end of the day." I could hear Crystal's voice through the closed study door, soft and broken, talking to Tyler about something ordinary. Breakfast, maybe. The kind of conversation a mother has when she is trying to keep the world normal for her child while her own world is falling apart. Greg thought the lawsuit was a wall he had built around Crystal. Dwayne saw it for what it actually was. A door Greg had opened into his own house, and we were about to walk right through it. "We are not going to defend this lawsuit," Dwayne said. "The lawsuit is noise. When you submit fabricated medical records to a state regulatory body, you commit perjury on a federal level. Your son-in-law just handed us the weapon we need." He paused. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of every year between the parking garage and this phone call. "I have been waiting for this call." I hung up and sat in the quiet study, feeling the first real shift in the balance of power. Through the door, Tyler laughed at something. The sound landed in my chest like a fist. That boy had no idea what was happening around him, and I intended to keep it that way. Dwayne would handle the legal architecture. He would subpoena billing records, file countermotions, and build the perjury case from the public side. But public records would only show us the surface of Greg's operation, to see what he was truly hiding. The scale of the fraud, the source of his funding, the real reason 3 patients were dead. I needed someone who could read the numbers beneath the numbers, someone still inside the system. I picked up the encrypted phone again and dialed a different number. This one rang through to a secure line inside the Department of Health and Human Services. Robin Travers picked up on the 4th ring, and the moment I said the word Cedarbrook, I heard her chair stop moving. Robin was 50 years old, a career data analyst at HHS OIG who had spent 23 years reading Medicare billing reports the way a composer reads sheet music. She could find a fraudulent charge buried in 10,000 legitimate ones, the way most people find a misspelled word on a page. She and I had worked 6 cases together before I retired, and on the biggest one. A multi-state phantom surgery ring, billing Medicare for tens of millions in procedures that never happened. It was Robin who cracked the code pattern that brought the entire network down. "Leonard Harrington," she said, "I assumed you were sitting on a porch somewhere reading the newspaper." "I am taking a break from the porch," I said. "I need a shadow check on a private surgical clinic in Burlington, Vermont. Cedarbrook Surgical Center. Owner is a surgeon named Greg Sherwood." Silence. 3 full seconds. For a woman who processed information the way other people breathed, 3 seconds was an eternity. "How did you get that name, Leonard?" She did not explain why she was asking. She did not need to. The fact that she asked at all told me Cedarbrook had already appeared somewhere in the system. A flag. A footnote. A number that did not sit right on someone's quarterly review. Robin had seen something, and now I was calling her about the same clinic from a farmhouse in Vermont, and the coincidence was loud enough to make her stop typing. I told her what I knew: the patient deaths, the forged signatures, the lawsuit. I did not tell her about the severed phone line or the cameras or the badge I had taken out of the safe. Robin was inside the system. She needed clean information, not the operational details of a retired agent running a private war from his study. Robin once told me that every fraud leaves a heartbeat in the billing data. A pulse of codes and charges that repeats too perfectly to be organic, too rhythmic to be human error. She called it the pulse. In 23 years, she had never missed it. "Give me 2 hours," she said, and hung up. I sat in the study and waited. The gray winter light moved across the oak desk while I listened to Crystal reading to Tyler in the next room. A children's book about a bear who could not find his way home. Tyler laughed at the bear's mistakes, and the sound came through the wall thin and clear. And I thought about 3 families in Vermont who would never hear their people laugh again because a man in a monogram lab coat had decided their lives were worth less than a billing code. Robin called back in 90 minutes. She did not waste a syllable. Cedarbrook is billing at 3 times the expected volume for a clinic with 4 surgical suites, she said. I could hear her keyboard clicking beneath her voice, pulling numbers as she spoke. The procedure clustering is textbook. High reimbursement orthopedic codes repeating on a weekly cycle that no legitimate practice could sustain. Revenue per patient is 46% above the regional benchmark. 3 times the expected volume. That meant Greg was not just overbilling for procedures he performed. He was operating on people who did not need surgery, collecting the maximum reimbursement for each one, and betting that the bodies would not pile up fast enough for anyone to notice. This is not an error, Robin said. This is not aggressive billing. This is a system. Leonard, someone built this from the ground up to move as much Medicare money as possible through that clinic before anyone noticed. And the patients who died? I asked. Collateral damage, she said. Her voice was flat in the way that only comes from a woman who has seen this kind of arithmetic before. You run that many unnecessary surgeries with that kind of volume pressure, people die. It is not accident, it is math. I set the phone down and stared at the numbers I had written on the back of an envelope. Greg Sherwood was not a surgeon who had made 3 terrible mistakes. He was the operator of a billing factory disguised as a clinic, and the dead patients were not failures of care, but the cost of running the machine at full speed. But Robin's data only showed me the surface. To see who was funding the operation, who was pulling the financial strings, and where the money was actually going, I needed to get inside Cedarbrook's own servers. I needed physical access to a system Greg would never willingly open. I looked at the study door. Crystal was still reading to Tyler, and I had just figured out exactly how to get inside that clinic. I drove 7 miles under the speed limit the whole way to Burlington because a man in a hurry looks like a man with a plan. And Greg Sherwood could never know I had one. Crystal sat in the passenger seat with her fingers drumming the armrest in that same nervous rhythm Ruth makes when she is scared. I told her we were going back to Cedarbrook so she could pick up her personal items from her old office. A coffee mug, a framed photo of Tyler. Things a woman leaves behind when she flees her workplace in panic. Crystal did not question the reason. She was too exhausted to question anything. The parking lot was half empty under sodium lights that turned the refreezing ice the color of old tea. Crystal hesitated at the clinic entrance, her hand stopping an inch from the glass door. You worked here 8 years, I said, steadying her elbow. You have every right to walk in. She straightened her shoulders and pushed through. The reception desk was unmanned. I noted 2 security cameras in the lobby, one in the east corridor ceiling, and at the far end of the hallway, a brushed steel door with no window and an industrial-grade Medico lock. The server room. No keycard reader, which meant a physical key existed somewhere in this building. I memorized the layout in the time it took Crystal to sign the visitor log. She led me down the east corridor toward her former billing office. Supply closet, break room, server room, 3rd door on the left. I counted paces between each one. Taped to Crystal's office door was a child's crayon drawing. Stick figures in bright colors. Labeled in wobbly letters, Mommy at work. Tyler's drawing. The tape was fresh. Crystal stopped walking and stared at it, and I understood immediately that Greg had left it there on purpose. A territorial marker. A message that said this space still belongs to me. And so does the boy who drew this picture. Inside the office, the filing cabinet had been emptied and fitted with a new lock. The desk drawers held nothing but blank paper. Greg had sanitized Crystal's workspace completely. Every billing record, every patient file she might have used to corroborate what she had told me. Gone. He was not just covering his tracks, he was erasing hers. And that level of operational discipline told me Greg was far more dangerous than a surgeon who had gotten greedy. He was methodical. He had been planning for this. I told Crystal to check the break room for a mug she had left behind. She nodded and walked back down the corridor. The moment she turned the corner, I pulled out my phone and photographed the server room door lock, the hallway camera angle, and the emergency exit at the corridor's end. 3 photos. I sent them to Robin's encrypted number in a single burst. Then I pocketed the phone and leaned against the wall like a tired old man waiting for his daughter. Crystal came back with the mug in her hands, but her face had changed. "Dad, someone has been in my email," she whispered. "The password I used for 8 years does not work anymore. He changed it the day I left." Before I could answer, the emergency exit at the end of the corridor slammed open. Greg walked in from the parking lot with his surgical coat still on and his phone pressed to his ear. He stopped mid-sentence when he saw us standing in the hallway. His eyes moved from Crystal's face to my hand, where my phone was still visible, the camera app open on the screen. He spoke into his phone without breaking eye contact with me. "I will call you back." He pocketed it with the precision of a man who controls every motion of his hands for a living. Then he smiled. "Leonard, I did not know you were a photographer." The smile did not reach his eyes. He had come through the emergency exit, not the front entrance. He had arrived within minutes of our entry. There was a notification system in this building, and it had told him the moment we walked through the door. I forced my hand to tremble as I slid the phone into my coat pocket. The shaky old man, the harmless father-in-law. "Just taking a picture of Tyler's drawing for Ruth," I said. "She misses the boy." Greg's gaze moved from my face to the server room door behind me. He held it there for 2 full seconds, calculating, measuring, deciding what I might have seen. Then he took 1 step forward and another, until he filled the width of the hallway the way a surgeon fills a doorway before an operation. And I understood, with the clarity of 30 years reading guilty men, that whatever came out of his mouth next would be either a threat or a lie. And I needed to be ready for both. Greg's hand closed around my collar before I could finish the sentence about Tyler's drawing. He pulled me forward half a step, close enough that I could smell his cologne. Sandalwood and something astringent underneath. Clinical, as if the man laundered himself in his own operating room. His face was 6 inches from mine. "You think I don't have cameras in my own clinic?" he said. His voice was low and controlled, the voice of a man who had learned to threaten people in rooms where nurses could hear through the walls. "I saw you the second you walked in. Both of you." So the notification system was real. He had been watching from wherever he was, and he had driven back the moment the alert triggered. This was not a man who left gaps in his security. This was a man who monitored his own building the way I had once monitored investigation targets. "We just came for Crystal's things," I said. I kept my voice thin, uncertain. The voice of a frightened father-in-law who had made a mistake. "No need to make this ugly." "It is already ugly," Greg said. He released my collar and pointed at Crystal without looking at her. "You made it ugly when you moved into my wife's head." Crystal stepped forward. "Greg, please, we are just here to pick up a few things. We will leave." He raised 1 finger toward her face and she stopped talking. The gesture was practiced, automatic. A motion he had performed 1,000 times in their marriage. And the fact that it still worked on her from 3 feet away told me everything about the years Crystal had spent in that house learning to be silent. The shove came without warning, not a push. A flat palm strike to the center of my chest, surgical in its precision, the way a man hits when he has practiced on someone smaller. My shoulder blade hit the corridor wall, and my jacket squeaked against the linoleum as I went down. But I did not just fall. I controlled the fall the way I had been trained to control a dozen different kinds of physical contact in my career. My right hand dragged along the wall as I dropped, fingers finding the metal seam beneath the card reader housing mounted beside the server room door. The adhesive backing of the forensic logger peeled from my palm as I pressed the device into the gap. It seated flush against the housing with a click so faint it disappeared beneath the sound of my body hitting the floor. I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste copper. The pain was real. The hip that hit the linoleum was genuinely 69 years old, and it screamed at me from the floor. But the device was planted, and every second I stayed down was a second Greg spent believing he had won. "Greg, he is 69 years old," Crystal shouted. She dropped to her knees beside me, her hands on my shoulders. "What is wrong with you?" "Get him out of my clinic," Greg said. He straightened his surgical coat with both hands, tugging the lapels the way he probably tugged them before every operation. "Both of you. Now." He turned and walked toward the lobby without looking back. His footsteps were even and unhurried. A man who had just put an old fool on the floor and felt nothing about it. 69 years old, and I was lying on linoleum in Burlington, Vermont, and I had never felt more like the agent I used to be. I stayed down for another 10 seconds, long enough to watch a tiny green light on the logger blink once and go dark. Activation confirmed. The device was live. Every record Greg touched from this moment forward, every file he opened, every billing entry he modified on that server belonged to me. "I am fine," I whispered to Crystal. "Help me to the car, slowly." She pulled me up. I leaned on her more heavily than I needed to, and as I straightened, I let my hand brush the wall one more time, confirming the logger was flush and invisible. Crystal guided me down the corridor, through the lobby, and out into the frozen parking lot, where the sodium lights had turned the ice into dull amber. I waited until Crystal was in the car with the engine running. Then I pulled out the encrypted phone and typed 3 words to Robin. "Logger is live." The reply came in 4 seconds, a single line of numbers streaming across the screen, timestamps updating in real time. Data was already flowing from Greg's server. Patient records, billing modifications, access logs. I climbed into the passenger seat and closed the door. My hip throbbed. My chest ached where Greg's palm had landed. But the device was planted. The data was streaming, and the man who had shoved me to the floor had just carried a federal witness into his own system without knowing it. The bruise on my hip was already turning the color of a rotten plum, but the numbers on the screen hurt worse. Crystal had gone to bed an hour ago. Tyler was asleep in the room next to hers, and the farmhouse was quiet, except for the radiator ticking as it cooled and the faint hum of the laptop I had set up on the kitchen table. The forensic logger was streaming data faster than I expected. Greg had been busy. The first file that caught me was an email. Not medical records, not billing codes, but a message Greg had sent that afternoon to a contact listed only as Meridian Health Partners. I read it twice. He was begging. The language was professional. The formatting was clean. But underneath the corporate polish was a man on his knees. He was asking for an extension on a loan of $9,650,000. He referenced something he called the liability chain and promised he could clean it within days. He used the phrase cosigner issue in a sentence that made my stomach drop. Because he was not talking about a business partner. He was talking about Crystal. Meridian's reply was 1 line long. 72 hours, all legal risk cleared, or we proceed with full recovery. I sat back and stared at the screen. Meridian Health Partners was not a hospital network or a medical group. It was a private equity fund, and it held nearly $10 million in debt over Greg's clinic. The billing fraud Robin had identified was not greed. It was debt service. Greg had been running the clinic at triple capacity to feed payments to a fund that was now threatening to devour him. How do you tell your daughter that the man who stood beside her at the altar was already planning which prison she would die in? I called Dwayne. He answered on the first ring, which told me he had been working. "I pulled Crystal's employment records this afternoon," he said. No greeting, no preamble. Dwayne had shifted into the same operational cadence we had shared 20 years ago. Her electronic signature was configured as the default cosigner on every controlled substance order at Cedarbrook. Every Schedule II prescription, every surgical authorization, every one. I closed my eyes. The ice pack on my hip had gone warm. The coffee beside the laptop had gone cold. The world had gone very still. "Since when?" I asked. "Since her first week of employment, 8 years ago." She never knew. Leonard. The system auto-populated her credentials on every order. She did not sign those documents. The software signed them for her. I let that settle. 8 years. Greg had wired Crystal's signature into the system before he married her, before the first patient died, before any of it. "He married the fall person," Dwayne said, and his voice was flat with the kind of anger that does not raise its volume. "That is not a coincidence. That is recruitment." I hung up and sat alone in the kitchen with the laptop glowing blue-white against the dark ceiling. I pulled a notepad from the drawer and began writing the timeline. Not the timeline of the fraud, the timeline of the marriage. Greg hired Crystal as a billing coordinator at Cedarbrook. Within her first week, her electronic signature was configured as the default cosigner on all controlled substance orders. 2 years later, he married her. The overbilling scheme began the month after the wedding. Each patient death generated insurance payouts that serviced the Meridian debt. Crystal's auto-populated signatures made her legally liable for every fraudulent prescription. And the marriage itself ensured she could not be compelled to testify against him. Greg Sherwood had not built a marriage, he had built a detonator, and Crystal's signature was the wire connecting every charge. Ruth appeared in the doorway in her housecoat, her slippers quiet on the old floorboards. She looked at the laptop, at the notepad, at the expression on my face, and she knew. "How bad?" she asked. "Do not wake Crystal," I said. "Not tonight. Let her have one more night before she learns what he really married her for." Ruth stood there for a long moment, her hand on the doorframe. Her eyes reading the notepad upside down the way she used to read case files across a conference table in her prosecuting days. Then she turned and went back upstairs without another word. She understood. Some truths need morning light. I circled the date on my notepad. Crystal's first day at Cedarbrook, 8 years ago. I drew a line to today. Every signature, every prescription. Every death led back to that first Monday morning when a 30-year-old billing clerk sat down at a desk that had already been wired to destroy her. And in 72 hours, Meridian would light the fuse. I had been staring at the timeline for 20 minutes when Ruth came back downstairs. She stood in the doorway in her reading glasses and housecoat, and the first thing she said was not a question about my hip or whether I had eaten. It was the question of a woman who had spent 15 years as a federal prosecutor before she retired. "How bad?" I pushed the printouts across the table toward her. She sat down, pulled the overhead light closer, and began reading. She did not ask me to explain. She did not ask me to summarize. She picked up the first page and read it the way she had read 1,000 case files in her career, with the focused silence of someone who knows that the document will tell her more than the person who hands it to her ever could. "Stop hovering," she said without looking up. "Sit down and let me read like a lawyer, not a grandmother." So I sat. And I watched my wife sort the scattered printouts into 3 piles with the efficiency of a woman whose hands had never forgotten the work. Financial records on the left, patient death reports in the center, Crystal's forged signatures on the right. 3 piles, Ruth said quietly. Money, bodies, and our daughter. That is what this is. Ruth had not tried a case in 11 years, but her hands sorted evidence the way a surgeon's hands find a scalpel, without looking, without hesitating, without mercy. She read for 20 minutes. The kitchen clock ticked past 11. The furnace cycled on beneath the floorboards with a low rumble. I reheated coffee in the microwave and set a mug beside her elbow. She did not touch it. When she finally looked up, The expression on her face had changed. She was no longer my wife. She was the prosecutor who had once stared down a racketeering defendant so steadily that his own lawyer asked for a recess. She picked up the civil lawsuit Greg had filed and turned to the exhibits at the back. Her thumb pressed flat against one page, buckling the paper. "He filed the forged records as Exhibit C," she said. Her voice was careful and precise, the way it got when she found something she knew would end a case. "In federal court, under oath." I leaned forward. "He used the fabricated billing records to justify the damages claim against Crystal. Every dollar in that lawsuit is backed by documents he manufactured," Ruth said. She tapped Exhibit C with her fingernail. Filing fabricated documents in a federal court proceeding is not just fraud. It is perjury. It is fraud upon the court. It is a standalone federal crime completely independent of the medical fraud. And he signed the verification page himself. I swallowed hard. My mouth was dry from hours without water. And the word perjury landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. Greg had built that lawsuit as a weapon against Crystal. He had aimed it at her career, her finances, her custody of Tyler. But he had filed fabricated evidence under oath to make it work. And in doing so, he had opened a door he did not know existed. A door into federal criminal court. A door we could walk through. You think you know your wife after 43 years, and then she sits across from you at midnight and becomes someone the courtroom used to fear. Ruth pulled a grocery receipt from the counter and flipped it over. She drew 3 boxes on the blank side with a pen from the junk drawer. In the first box, she wrote Greg. In the second, Meridian. In the third, Crystal. She drew arrows between them. "Greg built Crystal as the fall person," she said, pointing at each connection. "Meridian holds the debt leverage. And the lawsuit is the thread that unravels all of it. Because the lawsuit is where he committed the federal crime in writing." She set the pen down and looked at me across the table. "You have been playing the weak old man," she said. "Fine, that got you the logger. But the next move is not undercover. It is legal, federal, the kind you used to run." She paused. The furnace ticked beneath us. The clock read 11:22. "It is time to use your real weapons. Leonard?" She slid her reading glasses off and folded them on top of the evidence pile. "Call Eugene Ballard in the morning. You are going to need someone who still has federal clearance, and you are going to need him before that 72-hour deadline runs out." She stood and pushed her chair in. At the doorway, she stopped. "And Leonard, do not tell Crystal about the signatures. Not yet. Not until we can tell her we already have the way out." I made 2 phone calls before the sun cleared the tree line. The first one ended a man's career. Ruth's instructions from the night before were still sharp in my mind. "Call Eugene Ballard. Use your real weapons." I stood on the porch at 6:15 in the morning, with frost-sharp air burning my lungs and the snow-covered pasture turning pale blue in the pre-dawn light. And I dialed a number I had not used in 4 years. Eugene Ballard was 63 years old. My former commanding officer at HHS OIG, and the only man I had ever met who could make a federal bureaucracy move at the speed of a freight train when he decided something needed to happen. He still held active security clearance and a network of CMS contacts built across 30 years of healthcare fraud investigations. He picked up on the second ring with a voice like gravel being poured into a bucket. "This better be worth a Tuesday at 6 in the morning," he said. I gave him the summary in operational shorthand. 3 patient deaths at a private surgical clinic in Burlington. Forged co-signatures embedded in the billing system for 8 years. A private equity fund holding nearly $10 million in debt over the clinic. A retaliatory lawsuit filed with fabricated exhibits. And a 72-hour deadline ticking toward a financial detonation that would bury my daughter under the wreckage. Eugene listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause I recognized. The pause of a man running calculations. 3 deaths and a billing fraud pipeline, he said. That is not a referral. That is a raid. I do not need a raid yet, I said. I need the billing freeze. Cut his cash and he cannot pay Meridian. Then he panics. And panicked men make mistakes. Another pause. Shorter this time. I will get you the CMS intake number, Eugene said. Direct line. Bypasses the standard 90-day review queue. Use it before noon, or the weekend processing cycle buries it. He read me the number. I wrote it on the back of my hand with a pen from the kitchen drawer because I did not trust paper in the wind. Then I hung up and dialed Dwayne. Filing that report was like cutting a fuel line. The engine would not explode. It would just stop. And everything Greg Sherwood had built would coast to a silent halt. Dwayne answered from his office in Burlington. I gave him Eugene's intake number and told him to file an emergency patient safety report with CMS requesting immediate suspension of Cedar Brook's Medicare billing privileges. The legal basis was specific documented patient deaths, forensic evidence of ongoing record falsification, and systemic billing fraud supported by Crystal's auto-populated co-signatures. Dwayne drafted the filing in real time over the phone. I could hear his keyboard through the speaker, each keystroke precise and deliberate. He read sections back to me for accuracy. When he reached the final paragraph, he stopped typing. Once I hit send, there is no pulling this back, he said. CMS billing suspensions become public record within 72 hours. Good, I said. Let it be public. Let Meridian see it too. The silence on the line told me Dwayne understood exactly what I was doing. The billing freeze would cut Greg's revenue to zero. When Meridian saw the public suspension, they would accelerate collections on the outstanding debt. Greg would be crushed from both sides simultaneously, and the pressure would force him into a mistake so large that no lawyer could contain it. You understand what happens next, Dwayne said quietly. Greg loses every dollar of Medicare revenue. That clinic dies in a week. Send it, I said. I heard the click of the enter key. It was the smallest sound in the world, and it was irreversible. Ruth found me on the porch 20 minutes later. She did not ask me if I was scared. She had been married to an investigator long enough to know that the moment after you file is the moment you stop sleeping. Is it done? She asked. I nodded. My coffee was bitter on an empty stomach, and the porch boards creaked under my weight as I shifted. The wood smoke from our chimney drifted across the yard and disappeared into the cold air. Is this the right thing? Ruth said, or the angry thing? I looked at her. The morning light was catching the silver in her hair, and her eyes were steady the way they had been the night before when she dismantled Greg's lawsuit on the back of a grocery receipt. This is not revenge, Ruth. This prevents death number 4. She held my gaze for a long moment, then she nodded. Then we had better be ready for what he does when the money stops. My encrypted phone buzzed at 9:47. Robin. I opened the message and read it twice. The forensic logger had captured a new batch of records from overnight. Greg had accessed and modified 14 patient files between 2 and 4 in the morning. Every one of them was a billing entry for a procedure that had not happened yet. He was preloading fake claims, racing to extract every dollar he could before the freeze hit. Greg's 14 phantom claims never made it through. The billing freeze landed before noon, and I knew it had worked because Robin sent me a single word on the encrypted phone, locked. What happened next? I pieced together later from the forensic logger's access logs, from the account the vendor gave Dwayne's investigator, and from what Crystal told me. I was not there to see it. But I have spent 30 years reconstructing the movements of desperate men from data. And Greg's movements that day read like a textbook collapse. The screen at Cedarbrook said, "Access denied," in red letters, and Greg typed his password 3 more times before he understood the lock was not a glitch. Every CMS billing portal was frozen. The scheduling system had flagged every procedure on the books for the remainder of the week. A federal suspension notice was embedded in the lockout screen, referencing a patient safety filing and an active investigation number. Greg called his office manager to the door and told her to contact the billing liaison. "Get it fixed by 1 o'clock," he said, as if a federal suspension could be resolved by a phone call and a firm tone. The office manager came back 4 minutes later. The liaison had told her it was not a system error. It was a federal action. They needed to contact CMS directly. There was nothing the liaison could do. Greg closed his office door. Through the logger, I could see him accessing file after file, checking whether any of the phantom claims he had entered overnight had processed. None had. Everyone was frozen in the queue, flagged, time-stamped, and now part of the federal record. 12 employees stood in the hallway of a clinic that had just performed its last billable procedure, and not one of them knew it yet. By noon, Greg had abandoned the office. The logger showed him logging out at 11:47 and not returning. He drove to an upscale restaurant in downtown Burlington to meet a medical device vendor. A lunch he had scheduled weeks earlier as part of a pivot to private pay revenue that no longer mattered. He sat down, ordered a steak he would not eat, and tried to conduct business as if his clinic was not dying in real time across town. The waiter brought the check at 1:40. Greg handed over his corporate card. The waiter returned. "I am sorry, sir. Would you like to try another card?" Greg's jaw tightened. He produced a personal card. The waiter left and came back again, holding both cards in his outstretched hand, the way a man holds evidence he does not want to touch. "I am sorry, sir. This one was also declined." There is a specific silence that follows a declined credit card in a room full of strangers. It is the kind of silence that sounds like a verdict. Silverware stops moving. Conversations pause at adjacent tables. Eyes find you and then look away, which is worse than staring because it means they have already decided what happened. Greg checked his phone under the table. There was a notification from Meridian's collections division. Account flagged. Credit line suspended pending review. He stood up, mumbled something about calling his bank, and walked out of the restaurant without paying. The vendor sat alone at the table with a $40 steak going cold and a check nobody had covered. In the restaurant parking lot, Greg sat in his car with the engine running and called Meridian's collections line. His hands were shaking. I know this because the logger captured the call audio through the clinic's synced phone system, and his voice was vibrating so badly the words came out in fragments. The collections representative was polite and mechanical. Greg's account had been escalated due to a federal billing action filed against Cedarbrook Surgical Center. The outstanding loan was now subject to accelerated review. A demand letter would be issued within 48 hours. "I can resolve this," Greg said. "I just need more time." 48 hours, Dr. Sherwood, the representative said. "This call is being recorded." The line went dead. Greg sat in the parking lot with his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his cologne mixing with the sharp smell of stress sweat in the closed car. Meridian had not waited for their own deadline to expire. They had been watching for a federal trigger, and the CMS suspension had given them exactly the justification they needed to accelerate. The walls were closing from both sides now, exactly as I had designed them to. Then Greg's phone rang again. Not Meridian, not his office. The caller ID read, Crystal Harrington. He stared at his wife's name pulsing on the screen, and for the first time in 2 days. The question on his face was not what I knew, it was what I had told her. Greg Sherwood's voice came through the laptop speaker in fragments, half words and half sobs. And I turned the volume up because a breaking man tells you everything if you let him. Crystal had not called Greg. She had started to. Standing in the kitchen with her phone in her hand, but I asked her to wait. I needed to hear what Greg did next before we made any move. The forensic logger gave me that. Through the clinic's synced phone system, I could hear Greg in his car calling Meridian one more time. The representative was polite, the way a guillotine operator is polite. Professional. Final. The fund would deploy an asset recovery team if the outstanding balance was not resolved. Full exposure of the clinic's billing irregularities to federal authorities would follow. Greg's voice cracked as he begged, "I can fix this," he said. "I just need her to sign. One signature and the liability shifts." I sat back from the laptop. One signature. He was going to try to make Crystal sign a statement transferring the fraud liability to herself. He was going to turn the unwitting fall person into a willing confessor. And he was going to do it with the same combination of charm and threat that had kept her silent for years. What kind of man sobs into a steering wheel at 3 in the afternoon and threatens an 8-year-old boy by 7? The answer arrived at 7:14 that evening. Crystal's phone lit up on the kitchen table. She picked it up, read the screen, and the color left her face so completely that for a moment I thought she was going to faint. She handed me the phone. The screen was still warm from her grip. The text was from Greg. It was not a plea. It was not an apology. It was an ultimatum delivered in the language of a man who had decided that leverage was the only currency he had left. "Sign by midnight, or I take Tyler and you never see him again. Do not test me. Crystal." Crystal's hands were shaking so badly her car keys jangled in her pocket. "Dad, he means it," she said. "He will take Tyler across the border. He has a colleague in Montreal. He has talked about it before." "He is not taking anyone anywhere," I said. "Show me that text again." I read it 3 times. Each time the words hit differently. The first time I read them as a father, and they made me want to drive to Burlington and end this with my hands. The second time I read them as an investigator, and I saw the evidence. The third time I read them as a strategist, and I saw the weapon Greg had just handed me. A man who threatens his own child in writing has given you the one thing no custody lawyer can argue against. Crystal did not see it that way. She grabbed her coat from the hook by the door and half-zipped it with one hand while reaching for her car keys with the other. "Please, Dad," she said. "We can be in Connecticut by morning. He will not find us." She stood at the door with her coat half-zipped and her keys in her fist, and she looked exactly like she had at 14 when she tried to run away from summer camp. Except this time, the thing chasing her was real, and running would not bring her home. Running would guarantee she never came home again. I put my hand flat against the doorframe. "If we run," I said, "every signature he forged becomes yours. Every death becomes your fault. Every judge in Vermont will see a woman who fled with a child in the middle of a federal investigation. We do not run. Crystal, we never run." She stared at me. Her jaw trembled. Then she dropped the keys on the counter, sank into the kitchen chair, and put her face in her hands. Junior sat cold and untouched behind her. The draft from the door she had opened cut through the warm kitchen like a blade. I picked up the encrypted phone and called Dwayne. "He just threatened his own son in a text message," I said. "I need an emergency custody motion filed tonight." Dwayne said he would have it drafted within the hour. He called back at 9:22. The custody motion was ready. But his voice carried something else, something heavier. "I found something while pulling Greg's legal filings," he said. "There is a second lawsuit. Sealed. Filed 3 days ago in federal court." I waited. "He is not just threatening Crystal, Leonard. He is suing you, personally. $4.2 million in tortious interference. The hearing is set for Friday morning." The kitchen was silent. Crystal had fallen asleep in the chair with her coat still half-zipped. The clock on the wall read 9:24. And somewhere in a sealed federal filing, my name was written next to a number that was designed to destroy me before I could destroy him. Crystal had Tyler's winter coat in one hand and the garbage bag of clothes in the other, and she was moving through the house like the walls were already on fire. I had made the mistake of telling her about the sealed lawsuit before she was ready to hear it. She had been asleep in the kitchen chair, and when I woke her and explained that Greg was suing me personally, something behind her eyes broke in a way I had not seen before. Not the controlled fear of the previous days, something deeper. The fear of a mother who has decided that the only option left is to disappear. He is suing you. Dad, she said, pulling Tyler's shirts from the dresser in handfuls. He is taking Tyler. He is going to destroy all of us, and we are just sitting here. Tyler appeared in the hallway in his pajamas, backlit by the bathroom light, his small silhouette perfectly still. He was clutching the stuffed rabbit he had brought from Burlington. He watched his mother tear through drawers and shove clothes into a garbage bag, and he did not cry. He just stood there, trying to understand. "Mommy, are we going on a trip?" he asked. Tyler was 8 years old, and he was standing in a hallway at 10 o'clock at night, learning what it looks like when adults break. That image burned itself into my memory more permanently than any crime scene photograph from my entire career. Crystal scooped up Ruth's medication bag from the bathroom counter and headed for the front door. She was talking fast, her words running together. Her college roommate in Virginia, a 12-hour drive. Greg would not think to look there. They could figure out the rest later. Ruth met her at the door. My wife did not raise her voice. She did not block the way with her body. She simply reached out and took the garbage bag from Crystal's white-knuckled grip and set it on the floor. The plastic crinkled against the hardwood, and then the hallway was silent. Every woman I ever watched run from a man like Greg, Ruth said, her voice steady and low, spent the rest of her life running. I will not let that be you. You do not know what he is capable of. Mom, I know exactly what he is capable of, Ruth said. That is why stay. Before I tell you what I said next, the words that finally stopped my daughter from running, are you still with me? If so, comment whether you think Crystal should have run or stayed, and add one reason. A quick note, the next part includes some dramatized details to deepen the emotional impact. What matters most is the lesson behind it. I walked to Crystal and took her hands. They were ice cold and shaking. I guided her to the kitchen table and sat her down the way I had sat down 100 witnesses in my career. People who were terrified and needed someone to give them a reason to stay in the room. Listen to me, I said. His lawsuit is built on fabricated evidence. It will collapse the moment it hits discovery, because every exhibit he filed is a document he forged. His threat against Tyler is now in writing, on your phone, and Dwayne is filing an emergency custody motion tonight, using Greg's own words against him. His billing is frozen. His credit lines are cut. Meridian is circling him like wolves. I held her hands tighter. He is not hunting us, Crystal. He is drowning. Every move he makes is a man thrashing in water, grabbing at anything he can reach. The lawsuit, the threats, the custody talk, none of it is strength. It is panic. I had spent 30 years building traps out of patience and paperwork, and for the first time my family was seeing the man who had done that work. Not the father in the flannel shirt. Not the retiree with the bad hip. The investigator who had watched men more powerful than Greg Sherwood destroy themselves because they could not stop moving when the smart play was to hold still. We are not running from Greg Sherwood, I said. Not tonight, not ever. Crystal stared at me. Tyler padded across the hallway and climbed into her lap, pressing his face against her chest. She wrapped her arms around him and held on, and the shaking slowed, and then it stopped. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She set Tyler gently on Ruth's lap. And then she looked at me with an expression I had not seen since she was 19 and told me she was going to law school. Determination without compromise. Then tell me everything, she said. Every signature, every death, every dollar. If we are staying, I am not staying blind. I opened the laptop and turned the screen toward my daughter. I closed the laptop before Crystal could read a single line. She looked at me like I had lost my mind, but I stood up and said, "The files are not the thing I need to show you. Come with me." I walked to the study. Crystal followed 3 steps behind, arms crossed, breathing still uneven. The study looked the way it always had. Oak desk, reading lamp, bookshelves covering the back wall, floor to ceiling. Crystal had done homework in this room. She had read her college acceptance letter on that desk. She thought she knew every inch of it. I pulled 3 books from the middle shelf: Hemingway, Faulkner, and a tax code manual I had never opened. Behind them was a recessed latch no bigger than a house key. I pressed it, and the bookcase panel swung inward on hidden hinges with a mechanical click that sounded in the silence of that house, like a lock being opened on 30 years of lies. The room behind it was windowless, 8 feet by 10. Dual monitors sat on a metal desk, both dark. A secure communications array was mounted on the left wall, indicator lights blinking green. On the back wall, pinned to a corkboard stretching corner to corner, was every financial record and patient file connected to Greg Sherwood's fraud, organized in the grid pattern I had used on 7 previous investigations. Crystal stood in the doorway. The blue standby glow from the monitors lit her face, and I watched her eyes travel from the equipment to the evidence board to the locked cabinet in the corner that smelled faintly of gun oil. "How long has this been here?" she whispered. "Since before you were born," I said. "Sit down, sweetheart. This is going to change how you see me." My daughter held my badge like it was made of something breakable, and I understood that the man she had loved for 38 years had just died in front of her and been replaced by a stranger with the same face. I placed my HHS OIG Special Agent badge on the desk between us. The brass caught the lamplight. I told her the truth. 28 years investigating healthcare fraud, Medicare billing schemes, and pharmaceutical kickback rings across 6 states, all classified, all conducted under civilian cover. Everyone in Stowe believed I was a retired accountant. That was the point. Crystal picked up the badge and turned it over. Her fingers traced the raised lettering. She gripped the cold metal edge of the desk with her other hand. 28 years, she said. Mom knew. Your mother was the first person I ever told, I said. She was prosecuting the same man I was investigating, a Medicare fraud case in 1994. That is how we met. Crystal's eyes went to the doorway. Ruth was standing there, leaning against the frame with her arms folded, watching us the way she had watched me deliver testimony in federal court. "You let me think you were an accountant," Crystal said. "My whole life, Dad." You raise a child in a house with a hidden room, and you tell yourself every day that the secret protects her. You tell yourself that the less she knows, the safer she sleeps. Until the night she stands inside that room, and you see that the secret was its own kind of wall between you and the person you were trying to save. Ruth stepped inside and sat on the edge of the desk. "He was not hiding from you," Ruth said. "He was standing between you and everything he spent his career fighting." The secrecy was agency protocol, and it saved this family more than once. "How many?" Crystal asked quietly. 7 networks, Ruth said. 7 fraud operations dismantled while you thought your father was doing taxes. I watched him do it. I helped him do it. And now we are doing it one more time. Crystal looked at the evidence board. She looked at the badge in her hand. She looked at me, and then at Ruth. And I saw the moment when the anger drained out of her face and something else took its place. Not forgiveness, not yet. Recognition. "Greg never had a chance, did he?" she said quietly. "He married into the one family that could take him apart." She set the badge on the desk. She pulled a chair to the monitors and sat down. The stale air of the sealed room smelled like old paper and warm electronics. And my daughter leaned forward with both hands flat on the desk, the way I had leaned over 100 case files in my career. "Show me how you build a case," she said, "because I know his billing system better than anyone alive, and I am done being the signature on someone else's crime." Crystal asked Ruth the question I had always dreaded. She turned in her chair, the monitor glow casting half her face in blue, and said, "What is the worst thing Dad ever did for a case?" Ruth looked at me. I nodded. If Crystal was going to work beside me, she deserved to know the man she was working with. Ruth sat on the edge of the desk and told the Appalachian story. In 2004, a Medicare fraud kingpin named Vincent Dory fled his federal indictment, and disappeared into the hills of eastern Kentucky. The marshals searched for 11 days and gave up. I did not. I spent 19 days living in the woods, sleeping under a tarp, tracking a man who had distributed counterfeit cardiac drugs through a network of rural pharmacies. 7 patients died from those drugs. I found Dory in a hunting cabin on day 19. He was unarmed. I sat across from him at a plywood table and read him the name of every patient who had died because of what he sold. Then I asked him to stand up and walk out with me. He did. Ruth prosecuted the case. Dory got 40 years. Ruth spoke about my career the way a widow speaks at a funeral, except the man she was eulogizing was sitting 10 feet away, already planning his next operation. "And Greg?" Crystal asked. "Compared to that man?" "Greg is a bookkeeper who got greedy," Ruth said. "Your father has taken down people who made Greg Sherwood look like a parking ticket." Crystal turned back to the evidence board. Something had shifted behind her eyes. She was no longer looking at the board as a victim reading her own case file. She was looking at it the way I did, like a map. "These 3 codes," she said, tapping the board with a dry erase marker. The tip squeaked against the surface. "He billed them on every patient. Even outpatient consults. I flagged it twice, and he told me it was standard bundling." I leaned in. The codes were surgical supply charges, each one inflated to 3 times the actual cost. Crystal had seen them from inside the billing system for years. She knew which codes were legitimate and which ones Greg had fabricated, and she could identify them faster than Robin's forensic analysis ever would. "It is not bundling," I said. "It is phantom billing. Robin can match these against actual procedure logs from the logger data." Crystal uncapped the marker and began writing directly on the evidence board, circling code clusters and drawing lines between billing entries that connected to the same inflated supply charges. For the first time in 28 years, I was working a case with my own daughter, and she was better at reading the financial architecture than half the analysts I had trained. The room was growing warm with 3 bodies and running electronics. The sealed air smelled like old paper and heated circuit boards. Ruth watched us work from the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression carrying something I had not seen from her in years: pride without reservation. Then the encrypted feed chimed. I turned to the left monitor and opened the intercept log. A new call, captured 7 minutes ago through the forensic logger's mirrored connection. Greg's voice, panicked and slurred, talking to someone at Meridian's Asset Recovery Division. "She took everything," Greg said through the speaker. "She is at her parents' house in Stowe. I need your people there tonight." The voice on the other end was flat and professional. "We will have 2 men at your location in 90 minutes. Have the address ready." The black dot on the surveillance monitor moved north on Route 100 at 62 miles per hour, and I had 90 minutes to turn a farmhouse into a fortress. I switched to the perimeter cameras. The driveway was dark, the road was empty. But on the Burlington feed, a black SUV was pulling out of a downtown parking structure and merging onto the northbound highway. 2 pale headlights crawling through the Vermont darkness toward Stowe, toward my grandson sleeping upstairs. "Ruth," I said. My voice was calm because calm was the only thing I had left to give them. "Wake Tyler, move him to the upstairs bedroom, lock the door. Do not come out until I say." Ruth did not ask questions. She turned and walked up the stairs. I heard Tyler's sleepy voice, and then the bedroom door closing and the lock clicking into place. I opened the locked cabinet Crystal had not noticed. Inside was a satellite phone and a leather folder marked Contingency, holding the arrest support protocol Eugene and I had drafted together years earlier, chain of custody forms, use of force parameters. Everything a case like this would need to survive a defense attorney's cross-examination. The leather smelled old and cracked. I had prepared this folder 9 years ago and hoped I would never open it. I picked up the sat phone and the folder together, tasted copper flooding my mouth, and dialed Eugene Ballard's emergency line. "Eugene, They are coming to the house. I need federal backup at my location within the hour. Eugene picked up on the first ring, which meant he had been sleeping with the phone on his chest again. The habit of a man who never stopped expecting the call. 2 operatives, I said without preamble. 1 SUV, black, heading north on Route 100. 75 minutes out, maybe less. They think they are doing a document recovery. Greg told them Crystal stole files from the clinic. Armed? Eugene asked. His voice was sharp and clear, no trace of sleep. Meridian does not send unarmed men for asset recovery. You know that. I gave him the compressed picture. A farmhouse containing a 67-year-old woman, a 38-year-old mother, and an 8-year-old boy asleep upstairs. The intercepted call confirming Greg had authorized the visit and provided the address. The forensic logger feed showing the SUV's GPS beacon moving steadily through the Vermont dark. Eugene listened the way he always listened. No interruptions, no wasted words. When I finished, he exhaled once and started running options. Local police would escalate unpredictably. A midnight call about armed men heading to a farmhouse would bring sirens and floodlights and the kind of chaos that gets people shot. State troopers lacked jurisdiction on a federal fraud case and would defer to local anyway. Neither option protected my family without creating a firefight on my front lawn. I have a 4-man unit in Burlington, Eugene said. Rapid response. They can be rolling in 15 minutes if I make one call. How many times can a man my age ask the same question and still believe the answer matters more than what he will do if help does not arrive in time? I asked it anyway. Make the call. And Eugene, bring arrest warrants, not just for the enforcers, for Greg. The silence on the line lasted 2 seconds. Then Eugene said something that changed the shape of the entire night. Already ahead of you. The CMS filing gave us probable cause since this morning. I had the warrant paperwork drafted before dinner. I was waiting for a reason to execute. And your son-in-law just gave me one. The CMS billing suspension I had filed that morning was not just a financial weapon. It was a legal trigger. The moment Greg responded to the freeze by sending armed operatives to recover evidence. He converted a civil fraud investigation into an obstruction case with criminal exposure. Eugene had seen it coming before I did. The unit doubles as an arrest team, Eugene continued. We neutralize the enforcers, secure the scene, and take Greg into custody on the warrant. 2 problems, 1 deployment. Where is Greg now? I asked. Based on your intercept, he is still in Burlington. If he is smart, he stays there and lets the operatives do the work. If he is stupid, he follows them. He will follow them, I said. He cannot help himself. Eugene gave me the positioning instructions. Keep the family away from windows. Leave the porch light on as a marker so the federal team could identify the house from the road without using flashlights or radio chatter. Do not engage the operatives under any circumstances. I was the anchor point, not the strike team. Do not engage, Eugene repeated. He said it the same way he had said it in 2003 outside a warehouse in Memphis. And both times, I knew I would do whatever the moment required, regardless of the instruction. Will your men beat the SUV? I asked. The pause was longer than I wanted it to be. I could hear Eugene calculating distances, road conditions, the 15 minutes it would take to wake 4 agents and get them armed and mobile. Give me 90 minutes, he said. Keep your head down. The line went dead. I set the sat phone on the desk and stared at the surveillance monitor. The SUV's dot had just passed Waterbury. 43 minutes out. The federal team needed 90. The math was not complicated, and it was not in my favor. I walked out of the surveillance room and through the dark house. Upstairs, I could hear Ruth's footsteps, steady and deliberate, moving Tyler's mattress into the hallway closet. The boy murmured something in his sleep. The bedroom door closed. The lock clicked. I went to the front door. The handle was ice cold under my hand. I opened it, reached up, and turned on the porch light. A sharp yellow rectangle fell across the untouched snow, and the winter air hit my face like a slap. The taste in my mouth was copper and old adrenaline, the phantom flavor of every operation I had ever waded through in 28 years. I stood in the lit doorway and looked out at the dark tree line where the driveway disappeared into the road. Somewhere behind me, Ruth was hiding my grandson in a closet. Somewhere ahead, headlights were coming through the night. The first sign that help had arrived was the absence of sound. Birds stopped calling in the eastern tree line at 12:27 in the morning, and only men moving with training can silence a forest. I was watching the perimeter cameras when the thermal signatures appeared. 4 shapes, body-warm orange against the blue-black cold. Spreading through the woods in a crescent formation I recognized from a training manual I had helped write 15 years ago. They moved without flashlights, without radio chatter, without breaking a single branch. Within 12 minutes, they had established positions covering the driveway approach, the north pasture, and both flanks of the house. My sat phone vibrated once, a text from Eugene. One word, set. I typed back, "Porch light is your marker. I will be in the chair." Eugene's reply came in 3 seconds, "Do not engage. You are bait, not backup." The 90-minute gamble had paid off. Eugene's unit had driven faster than the math predicted, or the SUV had driven slower, or both. It did not matter. What mattered was that my farmhouse was no longer an undefended home. It was a staged federal ambush, and the men walking into it would never see it coming. I turned off the surveillance monitors. I closed the hidden room and pushed the bookcase panel flush until the latch clicked. Then I climbed the stairs. Tyler was asleep in the hallway closet with his grandmother's hand on his chest, and he would never know how close the world came to his door that night. Ruth sat with her back against the wall, her legs stretched out, Tyler's head in her lap. The bathroom light leaked under the door and cast a thin gold line across the boy's sleeping face. "How many are out there?" Ruth whispered. "4 of ours in the trees," I said. "2 of theirs on the road. It is enough." Ruth looked at me the way she had looked at me on every operation night for 28 years. Not with fear, with the specific patience of a woman who has sent the same man into the same darkness more times than either of them can count. "Come back inside when it is over," she said. "Promise me that." "I promise," I said. I kissed the top of Tyler's head. His hair smelled like the shampoo Crystal had packed in the overnight bag 2 days ago, and the scent of it nearly broke me in a way that nothing else that night had managed. I went downstairs. I brewed a pot of coffee in the dark kitchen, working by memory because I did not want light visible from inside the house. I poured a single mug, carried it to the front porch, and sat down in the rocking chair. The shotgun went across my knees beneath the wool blanket. The stock was already warm from where I had held it against my side coming down the stairs. I settled the blanket over it and wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. The porch light made me a portrait in a frame. An old man in a rocking chair with a cup of coffee and a blanket on his lap. The kind of image that makes dangerous men feel safe, which was exactly what I needed them to feel. I rocked slowly. The chair creaked against the frozen porch boards in a rhythm as old as the house. The coffee steam rose into air so cold it vanished in inches. Pine and frost and absolute stillness. No wind, no sound from the tree line where 4 federal agents lay in positions they could hold for hours. 30 years of this work, and it always ended the same way. Sitting in the dark, waiting for someone who did not know I was waiting. The settings changed. Memphis. Appalachia. A parking garage in Boston. A farmhouse in Vermont. But the waiting was identical every time. And the taste was always the same. Black coffee gone cold on the tongue, and the metallic edge of controlled fear that I had never gotten used to, no matter how many times I swallowed it. The mug cooled in my hands. The minutes passed. The forest held its breath. At 1:58 in the morning, a low engine growl rose from the south end of Mountain Road. Distant at first, then building, the sound of a heavy vehicle moving slowly through the dark. The kind of slow that means the driver is looking for a house number. Headlights swept across the tree line at the bottom of the driveway. Two beams cutting through the black, painting the snow-covered pines in white light for half a second before swinging toward the house. The engine dropped to idle. The headlights stopped moving. A door opened. I set down my coffee. I placed both hands on the blanket across my lap. The gun oil smell rose warm between my fingers. I waited for the footsteps to begin. The iron gate folded like tinfoil, and the sound it made was the sound of a man who had stopped thinking. The SUV came through at full speed, scattering iron rails and gravel across the front yard. Its tires bit into the frozen ground, and the rear end fishtailed, carving black arcs into the snow before the driver corrected and accelerated up the driveway. The headlights swung across the house and locked onto the porch. Turning my rocking chair into a stage, the vehicle skidded to a stop 30 feet from the steps. Exhaust billowed into the cold air and mixed with the wood smoke still drifting from the chimney. I did not move. I did not reach for the blanket on my lap. I rocked once, slowly, and listened to the engine idle. He came through the gate instead of around it. That told me everything. He was not here to talk. He was not here to negotiate. He was here to break things, and the gate was just first. The passenger door opened, and Greg climbed out holding a steel crowbar. He was wearing a black overcoat over what looked like the same clothes from the restaurant. His face was white in the headlights, jaw clenched, eyes moving too fast. Behind him, two men emerged from the driver's side and the rear door. Large men, dark jackets. Hands inside their coats in a way that meant they were not reaching for business cards. The three of them walked toward the porch in a loose V formation, with Greg at the point. The crowbar caught the porch light and threw a line of silver across the snow. And I thought he brought a crowbar to a federal ambush, and he does not even know it. In the tree line. 4 agents adjusted their positions without making a sound. I could not see them. I did not need to. "Where is she?" Greg shouted. His breath came out in ragged white bursts. "Where is Crystal?" I rocked the chair. The frozen boards creaked. "Check the back," Greg said to the enforcers without taking his eyes off me. "Break the door if you have to." "I would not do that if I were you, Greg," I said. He stopped walking. The 2 enforcers stopped behind him. The burnt rubber smell from the fish-tailed tires hung in the air like a warning nobody was reading. "You think you can stop me?" Greg said. "You think sitting in that chair means anything? I know what you did. You filed the complaint. You froze my accounts. You took everything from me." "I did not take anything from you," I said. "I stopped you from taking more." Greg took another step forward. The enforcers flanked wider, one moving toward the side of the porch, the other staying behind Greg like a shadow, with hands still buried in his jacket. Their shoes crunched on the gravel. The SUV's engine idled behind them, headlights still pinning me in white light. I picked up my cold coffee. I took a slow sip. The taste was bitter and flat, and I drank it the way a man drinks when he has nowhere to be and nothing to fear. Because that was the performance, and the performance was everything. There is a moment in every operation when the target realizes the ground has shifted. You can see it in the eyes, the half-step backward, the jaw unlocking, the sudden awareness that the quiet is not empty but full of something they cannot identify. Greg hit that moment 10 feet from my rocking chair. He looked at me. Then he looked at the dark tree line, then back at me. His grip on the crowbar loosened by a fraction. "Evening, Greg," I said. "I made coffee. Figured you would be coming." "You think this is funny?" His voice cracked. "You destroyed my clinic. You froze my accounts. You turned my wife against me." "I did not turn anyone, son. I just turned the lights on. You built everything that is underneath them." Greg's mouth opened and closed. He was searching for the thing that was wrong with this scene. An old man, alone on a dark porch in the middle of the night with 3 men who had come to hurt him. And the old man was drinking coffee like it was Sunday morning. That did not make sense. That did not make sense at all. Greg raised the crowbar and took 1 step toward the porch stairs. Behind him, the taller enforcer reached inside his jacket. And from the tree line, from 4 positions simultaneously. Red laser dots appeared, 2 on Greg's chest. 1 on each enforcer's chest. Center mass, a small red circle glowing against dark fabric like a period at the end of a sentence Greg had not finished reading. I started with the number, because numbers are what break men like Greg Sherwood. Not threats, not accusations, the proof that someone has been counting. Greg was standing 10 feet from the porch steps with the crowbar at his side and the red dots on his chest that he had not yet noticed. The enforcers flanked him, hands still inside their jackets. The SUV idled behind them, headlights turning the scene into a stage where I held every light and every line. I did not raise my voice. I never have. $9,650,000, I said. That is what you owe Meridian. Shall I tell you what they said when you begged for more time? Greg's jaw tightened. The crowbar shifted in his grip. Margaret Colby was 71 years old, I continued. Harold Fenn was 64. You billed their deaths as elective procedures and collected the insurance. Your wife's electronic signature is on every filing, and she never signed a single one. You do not know what you are talking about, Greg said. His voice was thinner than it had been 30 seconds ago. You are a retired accountant. I let that hang in the air. I rocked the chair once. The boards creaked. The 3rd patient died on a Tuesday, I said. You altered the anesthesia record within 48 hours. The original is on a federal server now. So is the altered version. Side by side, time-stamped. I fed Greg his own secrets, the way you feed rope to a man who is hanging himself. Slowly, steadily, letting gravity do the work. The crowbar lowered another inch. Greg's breathing was accelerating. Each exhale a white burst that came faster than the last. The sharp animal smell of his sweat cut through the cold air and reached me on the porch. His body knew what his mind would not accept. Now let me tell you about the day you shoved me at Cedarbrook, I said. Greg blinked. The crowbar stopped moving. You pushed a 69-year-old man to the floor in front of your staff. You remember that. What you do not remember is what I did on the way down. I set my coffee mug on the armrest with deliberate care. I controlled the fall. I turned my body so my right hand brushed the server room card reader housing. And in the 2 seconds I was on the ground, I pressed an adhesive-backed device into the seam of that housing. You gave me 3 seconds. I only needed 2. Greg's face went white under the headlights. Not red, not angry, white. The color of a man who is recalculating every moment of the past 2 days and finding a different answer in each one. Every file you have modified since Tuesday, I said, has been streaming to a federal analyst in real time. Every record you falsified. Every midnight billing entry you preloaded. Every patient file you altered between 2 and 4 in the morning. Captured, cataloged, transmitted. That is illegal, Greg whispered. That is. You cannot. It is a court-authorized forensic monitor placed pursuant to a federal healthcare fraud investigation, I said. Signed by a judge, executed by an agent, supervised by the Office of Inspector General. I stood up from the rocking chair for the first time. The blanket fell away. I did not reach for what was underneath it. I did not need to. I am not a retired accountant. Greg. I never was. The word came out of Greg's mouth the way vomit comes. Involuntary, ugly, impossible to take back once it hit the air. He spun toward the enforcers with his eyes wild and his body shaking, and he screamed it across the frozen yard. Kill him, right now, do it. The enforcers did not move. They were professionals. They had seen the red dots before Greg had, and professionals know what laser sights mean. They stood perfectly still with their hands inside their jackets and their eyes on the tree line. "I would not move if I were you boys," I said quietly. "Look down." They looked. 2 red dots held steady on their chests, 1 each, center mass, perfectly still. The dots did not waver because the men behind them had been holding positions in cold weather for longer than Greg had been a surgeon. Greg turned back to me. His mouth was open. The crowbar hung at his side like a dead limb. He looked at the red dots on his own chest, and then at the dark trees, and then at me. And I watched the full scope of his miscalculation arrive behind his eyes like a slow-moving freight train. From the tree line, a voice that was not mine called out through the frozen darkness. "Federal agents, hands where we can see them, now!" I pressed the button Eugene had given me, and the night turned into noon. Tactical floodlights mounted in the tree canopy blazed to life, turning the farmyard white. Every shadow vanished, every face was exposed. The SUV's black paint gleamed like wet stone, and the 3 men standing in my driveway were suddenly visible from every angle to every agent in the tree line. The enforcers were professionals. They saw the laser sights on their chests, saw the 4 agents emerging from the trees in tactical gear with weapons raised. And they made the calculation in under 2 seconds. Both men dropped to their knees with hands behind their heads before the first command was finished. One of them was already spreading his fingers wide, showing empty palms, his face pressed into the frozen gravel. 15 seconds from floodlight to full compliance. Men who have been arrested before know exactly what cooperation looks like. Greg had not been arrested before. He did not kneel, he crumbled. The crowbar clattered from his hand onto the gravel with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence he had been writing for 8 years. And the sentence was over. He dropped to all fours, then onto his side, curling into himself on the frozen ground. The sobs came out of him in broken waves, ugly and animal, echoing off the farmhouse siding. "Please," he gasped, "please, I will give you everything. The records, the money, everything. Please do not." He did not finish the sentence. He did not know what he was begging to avoid. He just knew it was over, and his body was responding before his mind could catch up. Eugene walked out of the tree line. He moved with the deliberate pace of a man who has done this more times than he can count and has never once rushed. He stopped beside Greg, crouched down, and spoke in the flat professional cadence I had heard him use in 6 states across 3 decades. "Gregory Sherwood, you are under arrest for healthcare fraud, conspiracy, and solicitation of murder. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Eugene zip-tied Greg's wrists behind his back while Greg sobbed into the gravel. The Miranda warning continued in the same even tone, each word precise. Each right articulated with the mechanical clarity of a man who understood that these sentences would be reviewed by defense attorneys for the rest of Greg's legal life. The front door opened behind me. Crystal stepped onto the porch with Ruth behind her. Crystal was wearing the flannel shirt she had borrowed from my closet 2 days ago, and she stood at the railing and looked down at the man she had married. Greg was face down on the gravel with his hands bound, his black overcoat twisted around him, the crowbar lying 2 feet from his head like a prop from a play that had ended. "He is smaller than I remembered," Crystal said quietly. I had promised myself I would not say anything to him. The arrest would be enough. The evidence would speak. But a father is not an agent, and some words have to be said out loud to a man's face. 2 agents hauled Greg to his feet and walked him toward the armored transport van at the end of the driveway. I stepped off the porch for the first time all night. My boots hit the frozen ground, and my knees ached from 2 hours in the rocking chair. And I walked across the yard to the van where Greg stood blinking in the floodlights, with his wrists bound and his face streaked with tears and gravel dust. I stood close enough that only he could hear me. "You married my daughter and turned her into a weapon," I said. "You threatened my grandson. You came to my house with armed men, and the whole time, Greg, the whole time, I was the one thing you never thought to be afraid of." I leaned closer. "Remember that. Every day you sit in that cell, the accountant beat you." Greg's eyes found mine. The fight was gone. The rage was gone. There was nothing left but the raw bewilderment of a man who had built his entire strategy on an assumption that turned out to be the one thing that destroyed him. "I did not know," he whispered. "I did not know what you were." The agents loaded him into the van, the doors closed on his face. The engine started and the van pulled away down the driveway, its red taillights shrinking into the Vermont dark. I turned back toward the porch. Crystal was holding Tyler. The boy had woken up and he was watching the lights disappear. Crystal's hand was over his eyes, but he was peeking through her fingers the way children do. Ruth came down the steps and put her arm around my waist. The salt on my lips was not coffee. The sun came up at 7:14 in the morning, and it was the first sunrise in 3 days that did not feel like a countdown. I had not slept. Ruth had taken Tyler back to bed around 3, and Crystal had fallen asleep on the couch with her coat still on. I sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and watched the dawn light spread gold across the snow-covered pasture through the window. The coffee tasted good. That was how I knew it was over. When the coffee tastes good again, the operation done. Eugene was still in the driveway. He had stayed through the night to supervise evidence processing. And now he stood beside the last federal vehicle, reviewing a thick packet of documents with a pen between his teeth. I pulled on my boots and walked out to meet him. The air was cold and clean. The broken gate had been removed by the tactical team and stacked neatly against the fence. Tire tracks carved dark lines through the snow where the SUV had fishtailed, but the gravel had already begun to settle back into place. Things repair themselves if you give them time. Fraud, conspiracy, falsified medical records, and solicitation of murder on tape, Eugene said without looking up from the packet. His lawyer will not even get to discovery before the plea offer lands. He closed the folder and looked at me. Russell's obstruction referral goes to the U.S. Attorney's Office today. If he signed off on those medical board complaints to protect Greg, the state licensing board will have his medical license before summer. Eugene's handshake lasted 3 seconds, but it carried the weight of a 30-year career, ending the way every agent hopes. The evidence clean, the family safe. The guilty man in the van. "And Crystal's signatures?" I asked. "The forged cosigns." Eugene pulled a single sheet from the folder and handed it to me. It was a forensic analysis summary from Robin's team. Every electronic co-signature Greg had attached to Crystal's billing profile included a system timestamp and an IP log. The timestamps proved Crystal was not in the building when the signatures were entered. Not once. Not on a single filing across 8 years. Every cosign was Greg's work, entered from his own office terminal, using her credentials. "She is clean," Eugene said, "completely. The civil lawsuit he filed against her is fraud upon the court. It will be vacated before the month is out. She owes nothing." She never did. I folded the paper and put it in my coat pocket. I would give it to Crystal when she woke up. I would hand it to her the way you hand someone a key to a door they thought was locked forever. Eugene's convoy pulled away in silence down the driveway. I watched the vehicles disappear around the curve, and then I went inside and poured another cup of coffee and sat down to wait for my daughter to wake up. The phone rang at 8:45. Crystal was awake by then, sitting at the kitchen table in my flannel shirt with her hands wrapped around a mug. Ruth was beside her. Tyler was upstairs building something with blocks. The steady clatter of his play drifting down through the ceiling like proof that children recover faster than anyone deserves. Crystal answered the phone on speaker. The voice on the other end was shaking. Lacey Finch was 34 years old, a nurse who had worked alongside Crystal at Cedarbrook for 6 years. Crystal had mentioned her once during the first night at the farmhouse. A quiet woman, reliable, the kind of colleague who covered your shifts without being asked. There is a kind of crying that sounds like laughter from the next room, and that was the sound Lacey made when she started talking. "Crystal, I kept copies," Lacey said. 18 months of shift schedules. He put you on the hardest surgical days with half the anesthesia staff on purpose. I should have said something sooner. "Why now?" Lacey Crystal asked. "Because I saw them put him in the van," Lacey said, "and I am not afraid anymore." Crystal hung up the phone. She set it on the table and stared at it for a long moment. Then she put her face in her hands and cried. Ruth sat beside her and rubbed slow circles on her back. I stood in the doorway and watched my daughter come back to herself. Not all at once, in pieces, like a house being rebuilt from the foundation up. The tears reached the corner of her mouth, and she tasted salt. And this time, the salt was not fear. It was the release of a woman, learning she was never the monster her husband told her she was. Crystal lifted her head. "I want to testify," she said. "Not just for me, for Margaret Colby and Harold Fenn. Someone has to say their names in a courtroom. When does a man stop being an agent and start being a grandfather again? Is there a moment, or does it happen the way snow melts? So slowly you do not notice until the ground is bare." Crystal's declaration still hung in the kitchen air when I stepped outside. She would testify. She would say the names. But that was ahead of us, and right now the morning was asking for something simpler. I stood on the porch where I had sat with a shotgun 4 hours ago. The rocking chair was still there. The coffee mug was still on the armrest, cold and half full. But the gravel driveway was empty. The broken gate had been cleared by the federal team and stacked against the fence post like firewood. The snow was turning gold as the sun climbed above the green mountains, and the tire tracks from the SUV were already filling with morning shadow. By afternoon, fresh powder would cover them. By spring, even the gate would be repaired. Some scars disappear if you let them. I was still wearing the same flannel shirt from yesterday. My body ached from the bruise Greg had given me at the clinic. My knees were stiff from 2 hours in the rocking chair. I felt every one of my 69 years standing on those boards, and for the first time in 3 days, that feeling was not a liability. It was just a body, tired and sore, belonging to a man who had done what he needed to do. The tire tracks in the snow would be gone by afternoon, but the bruise on my hip would take weeks. And the memory of Greg's face in the transport van would take longer than that. Birdsong had returned to the tree line. The same trees where 4 federal agents had crouched in the dark were now filling with the ordinary sounds of a Vermont morning. Cardinals. Chickadees, the small, indifferent music of a world that does not care what happened on your front lawn at 2 in the morning. The front door opened behind me. Crystal came through it carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed me one without speaking. The steam rose between us in the cold air and vanished. We stood side by side watching the sun clear the mountain ridge. The light moved across the pasture in a slow wave, turning white to gold to white again as it reached the far fence line. Crystal's hair smelled like the shampoo she had packed 3 days ago. And standing next to her in the morning light, I could see the 12-year-old girl she had been and the 38-year-old woman she was becoming at the same time. She put her head on my shoulder, the same way she had when she was 12 and her dog died. The same tilt, the same weight, the same trust that says the person next to you is the one solid thing in a world that moves. I put my arm around her. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, "for everything you did, for everything you were that I did not know about." "You do not thank a father for doing what fathers do," I said. "You just let him stand next to you in the morning and drink his coffee." She laughed. It was small and broken and beautiful. And it was the first laugh I had heard in that house since she arrived. The screen door banged open behind us, and Tyler came running onto the porch in his pajamas and socks. He slid on the cold boards and caught himself on the railing, and then he threw his arms around my legs with the force of a boy who does not yet understand proportion. If you have never had a child put their arms around your legs at 8 in the morning after the worst night of your life, you do not know what it means to win. Ruth followed him out. She wrapped her arms around Crystal and me both, and for a moment the four of us stood on the porch in a knot of flannel and pajamas and cold hands and warm breath. Tyler looked up at me. His socks were dark with porch moisture, and his hair was sticking up on one side, and his eyes were clear and serious. "Grandpa, is everything okay now?" I knelt on the cold porch boards. My knees protested. I looked my grandson in the eye, and I blinked away the salt before he could see it. "It is over, sweetheart. Everything is okay now." Ruth's hand found mine and laced our fingers together. I held Tyler against my chest and looked over his head at the mountains turning white to gold. Somewhere in a federal holding facility, Greg was waking up in a cell. Somewhere inside this house, a hidden room was going dark for the last time. And the work that mattered most was standing right here on the porch in pajamas and socks. A year changes the snow, but not the mountains. And it changes a family the same way. The shape holds, but everything underneath is different. I kept my promise to Tyler that morning on the porch. Everything was okay. It took 12 months to prove it. But the proof came in the form of courtrooms and verdicts and a little boy building a snowman in the pasture where federal agents once crouched in the dark. Greg Sherwood was sentenced in October. 22 years federal. Healthcare fraud. Falsification of medical records. Healthcare fraud resulting in death for 3 patients. And solicitation of murder, captured on tape the night he screamed those 2 words at men who were already kneeling in my driveway. His lawyer tried to argue diminished capacity. The judge heard the recording and denied the motion in 4 sentences. Greg will be 63 when he walks out. If he walks out. The same age I was when I planted the logger on his server room door. The emergency custody motion Dwayne filed that night became academic the moment the van doors closed on Greg. Meridian Health Partners did not survive the scrutiny. The federal investigation triggered by our case expanded into a national audit that uncovered similar debt trap arrangements at 11 other surgical centers across 4 states. The fund collapsed. Its directors faced their own indictments. The debt they held over Greg's clinic died with the fund, and Crystal's name was never attached to any of it. Dr. Gary Russell's medical ethics hearing lasted 40 minutes. They took his license in less time than it takes to brew a pot of coffee. His criminal referral is pending. The tortious interference suit Greg filed against me personally was dismissed the same week his indictment was unsealed. No court entertains a $4.2 million claim from a man facing 22 years for the conduct that generated it. You spend 30 years protecting strangers from men like Greg Sherwood, and then one of them marries your daughter. And you learn that the job was never really about strangers at all. Crystal won a civil settlement from Cedarbrook's malpractice insurers. She used the money to launch an independent patient safety advocacy practice in Burlington. She visits the farmhouse once a month with Tyler, who is 9 now and taller than the porch railing. Today he is in the pasture in his red coat, packing snow with the serious concentration of a boy who believes architecture matters even when the material melts. Crystal is at the kitchen table with case files spread in front of her and a phone pressed to her ear. Through the window I can hear fragments of her conversation. "I know what it looks like when a hospital hides a billing pattern," she said to whoever was on the other end. "I lived inside one for 8 years. Let me help you find it." Ruth was standing beside me on the porch. She watched Crystal through the glass and shook her head with an expression I recognized. Pride layered over something close to disbelief. "She sounds like you now," Ruth said. "God help whoever she is investigating." I did not argue with that. Crystal had taken the worst thing that ever happened to her and turned it into the tool she would use for the rest of her career. She kept her married name off every document. She introduced herself as Crystal Harrington. And when clients asked how she knew so much about medical billing fraud, she told them the truth. All of it. Every signature, every death, every dollar. She had learned from her father that the truth is the only weapon that never runs out of ammunition. Does a man who spent his life watching screens ever really stop watching? Or does he just change what he is watching for? The surveillance room behind the bookcase is still operational. I told Ruth I would shut it down. She believes me the way she has always believed me when I say things we both know are not entirely true. The evidence board is bare, the monitors are dark, but the perimeter cameras stay active, their feeds running to a small tablet I keep in the kitchen drawer. Old habits, the kind that keep people alive. I sat in the rocking chair with my coffee, the same chair, the same armrest where a shotgun rested under a blanket 1 year ago. The mug was warm between my palms, and the cold air felt like freedom instead of threat. Wood smoke drifted from the chimney where Ruth had built a fire while Crystal worked. The Green Mountains stood where they have always stood, unchanged by anything that happens at their feet. Tyler waved from the pasture. I waved back. I am 70 years old. I am sitting on a porch in Vermont with a cup of coffee and a clear conscience. My daughter is safe. My grandson is building a snowman. The woman I have loved for 41 years is standing behind me, humming something I cannot quite name. And the cameras are still on. That is the whole story. And to you listening to my story, remember this. I spent 28 years building cases against strangers, and the one case that mattered most was sitting across my kitchen table in tears. I nearly missed it. I nearly let the mask I wore to protect my family become the wall that kept me from saving my daughter. Do not make my mistake. Do not wait until the people you love are drowning before you show them who you really are. Some people will hear this and call it a revenge story. I understand why. A man came after my family, and I used everything I had to stop him. But I want you to know something. This was never about revenge. Revenge is anger looking for a target. What I did was a father standing between his daughter and the man destroying her life. If that sounds like a revenge story to you, then every parent who ever fought for their child is guilty of the same thing. I believe God put me through those 28 years for exactly this reason. Not for the cases I closed, but for the one night my daughter needed every skill I had ever learned. The real lesson is simple. Pay attention to the people you love. Watch for the signs. And when the moment comes, do not hesitate. If this revenge story moved you, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have done differently, or what moment hit you the hardest. Share this with someone who needs to hear that a quiet father can be the most dangerous protector in the room. And if you have not already, subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Please remember that certain details in this story were adapted for narrative purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals is coincidental. The heart of the message is what I hope stays with you. Take care of each other.